bit of good news.
A bit of good news.
Death and death.
There's no one in this particular conversation that will be excluded either intentionally or unintentionally. Each one of you will die.
Yes.
Right?
Praise God.
We will see over the course of this in healthcare, considering it from a moral theology, death and dying. And again, like Bernard had to delineate or demarcate parameters around which we're discussing. What I'm doing is framing a conversation about death and dying, and in order to do that, you necessarily have to include some kind of death and exclude some kinds of others, right? You could spend an entire class on just death. You could take a class on the Odyssey and just the kind of death that is tragic. I think we mentioned, if you remember from a couple weeks back, Dr. Waters lectured and said something about death is not tragic, to which I asked the question, does that mean some deaths aren't tragic? And it doesn't logically follow it. So what we're after today is actually this concept, euthanasia. And I intentionally wrote it in Greek because it comes from the Greek. And if you break the Greek words down, E, or epsilon, upsilon, is the word eu, and it means good. I'm missing a circumflex because I couldn't figure out how to make a circumflex and a diacritical mark, or reading mark rather, over the upsilon because, well, technology is still sometimes limited. And certainly my ability to interface with technology is sometimes limited. So, if you break the word down, it is from the Greek, and eu is good or well. And then thanatos is the Greek word for death. So you put those two words together, you transliterate them, and you get the English word that we spell euthanasia. So euthanasia. So what we're talking about today is a good death. And that means we're not talking about tragic deaths. We're not talking about the kinds of deaths that happen to children. We're not talking about stillborn infants. We are not talking about gang shootings or stabbings or being mugged in the middle.
Hate crimes.
We're not talking about any of those sorts of things. We're not talking about the things that often can and do go wrong in the world. What we are talking about is the death that, the fact that each one of us in this room will die at some point. Each one of us in this room is in the process of dying. Our cells die at alarming rates, it turns out. And they don't always grow back. So it's an interesting thing to be standing here talking about a good death. So what does it mean for Christians to begin to think about euthanasia? And what I'm not using the word to mean in our context is physician-assisted suicide. I'm using the word in its Greek origin of a good death. And so what does it mean for Christians to live in such a way as to have a good death? And this is then the ordinary sort of death. Sort of one assumption of a good death would be that it comes in old age, or it comes after a good life. So those are the kinds of deaths and the kinds of questions that we are going to explore today. But in order to do that, I think Christian moral theology has to look at culture experience, it has to look at the dying process, and it has to look at scripture, and it has to look at the theological tradition. Right? Because each one of those things sort of goes into constructing a understanding of a good death. A good death is going to be different across cultures, even if it has rootedness in Christian tradition. Right? The expression of grief is going to be different across cultures, even if it's rooted in Christian tradition. The witness of Scripture, we will find out, is not monolithic or hegemonic on its understanding of death. So we'll be looking at Scripture, culture experience, the biological process, which is one of my core assumptions. The grounds of my theology is that we are biological creatures. And that means that we die. And so we have to wrestle with, and we'll see the theological tradition wrestle with, where does death enter the picture and why does death enter the picture. So we'll start with culture experience. We're going to take about 10 minutes to write your obituary.
Yeah.
So each one of you take out a piece of paper or open your text, your notepad, and write your obituary.
For like the newspaper? Or
However, if you want to write an obituary as a memoir to a loved one, if you want to write it as if it's a newspaper press release to be included in the obituary, that's fine. Michael, you're joining us while you were about to write your obituary.
We're all gonna write our obituary. I know, right?
I've done CPE, so I've done that before.
Tossed on the EPC. Found dead under a handsome man. He will make my husband, come on.
Wait.
I don't know. I just keep thinking of in the World Tenenbaums, the
Oh, Lord.
Did you leave smiling? I think you left frowning. That was not a good. That's not a good day.
Let's go back together. What are some of the things that were included in your obituaries? Is there anyone willing to share publicly what they wrote? Lots of opinions in this class.
I think coming from the South, one thing that often shows up in obituaries is who you're survived by, and that can be a very long list, especially like my grandma was one of 15, and so when some of her earlier siblings started passing away and like there were still 9 or 10 kids around, they would list all of them. So that's fairly commonplace. So I think for me that would still, even though for me it wouldn't be siblings, but it would be like other family members that I'm survived by.
There's a lot of relationships. There's my relationship with my city, my relationship with my church, my relationship with my husband, my relationship with my parents and friends. My relationship with my parishioners, it's like mentioned, but it's different. It's different than the people that I get to cuss like a sailor around, you know.
Let's see another hand over here, and then we'll come back.
In writing mine, I really focused on what I hope my life will be, and particularly in my call, and prayerfully having accomplished what I would have had to accomplish.
And were you specific to the point of articulating that? Like
Yes.
This is what you did?
Yes. And just talking about how my life is worked out.
We'll go here and then back to you.
So what I wrote in that is because of that death led to an attention and funding in medical science area because it was because of the health issue. One of the
I'm just trying to choose what things I found important enough. And I realized that just as like how I hate writing a bio, that I think I would hate writing obituary, only because I'm not really, the accolades don't really mean that much to me. So I kept it as short as possible and just wanted to be just something simple that, you know, the reasons why I lived and who I lived for and what I hope my legacy would be.
Oh, I was just gonna say, place I think is significant, and that's something that was kind of highlighted by a friend of mine. He like had a job with Sony and was going all around and like hanging out with Usher and hot tubs and stuff. I don't know. And he came back to where he came from, which was like a very small rural place in Georgia, just because he said like this is where I'm born and this is where I'll be buried. So kind of your place that you come from and your relationship to that place I think is real significant.
That's an interesting segue, that concept of place, because we've been talking about cultural experience, right? One of the dominant themes of the class is the modern technoculture and how that has influenced all aspects of the modern experience, the contemporary experience. It has unalterably changed that. Now, there are folks actively working on trying to live forever. In fact, in one survey in the UK, 15% of us, 15% of UK residents wanted to live forever. And so I suspect if there are people that want to live forever, there will be folks that are trying to achieve that for them. But as you can see, this is sort of what technology and death look like. We will spend a little bit more time on that later. That's expensive. That's an expensive way to die. It often is an unpleasant way to die. What are some of the sort of cultural focal things that we think about when a loved one dies? And what are some of the practices around death?
The visitation.
Funeral, the visitation. What happens during the visitation typically?
Well, I mean, did you stop?
Let's work on one person talking at a time.
But in our context, we do a visitation at the funeral home, and that's for people who may not be able to come to the actual service the day of. And it's sort of a family hour for those who feel we give condolences and grief with the family. And the actual service, in the wake, where it gives us another opportunity to view the remains and comfort the family. I mean, the funeral is good for the family, the deceased is gone on, and then the actual service, in which, their life is celebrated.
What about some others?
Reading the genealogy of the dead person. That's a cultural thing in my country.
What country?
Burma.
Okay.
And also depends upon the ethnic group one belongs to.
So it would vary within. So the practice would vary significantly by the ethnic group.
Yes.
Interesting.
Very significant. Setting up a scholarship or a fund is a very common idea in the legacy of the died one.
Oh, can I switch a little bit? Looking at that picture,
Mm-hmm.
looking at that picture, going back to, I think, 2004 or 5, the Terry Schiavo case.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Okay.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Different expressions of grief, even before the person's gone.
One cultural thing that many immigrants from Mexico do is that you go back to Mexico and you try to be buried where you were born. That's something very important. At least when you die, you always tell your family, bury me in my hometown.
Right. And even that is actually a problem that technology creates, right? Your friend's experience of being flown all over and working with a multinational corporation, right? It used to be that you had a graveyard near the church. And families upon generations will bury there. If you had sort of more centralized, you think of some of the older communities, just the graveyard that's down on Chicago. It's a huge graveyard with huge headstones. So we can already begin to see some changes, right, from simple crosses in the church or on the farm, kind of a country parish, or not having even the ability to travel much beyond one's sort of immediate geographic surroundings. And so, as working as a hospice chaplain, there were often times where we had to wait for family members to fly in from out of state in order to do a service, so on and so forth. And in some cases that would violate certainly Orthodox Jewish tradition of burying the dead as quickly as possible. There again, though, you find a community that lives kind of immediately around itself. And so some of the cultural focal things then dictate other larger ways of life. Yeah.
Yeah, just when you were talking, something came to my mind that also is very, in some Hispanic Latino communities, it's very important that you're not born, or your body is not born, or disseminated, or
Cremated.
Cremated. Yeah, because even in the word of to bury in the Spanish word enterrar has a connotation to planting a plant. And so that's very important for many Hispanic communities, that you are buried and you are planted into the ground, because that's where you keep the cycle going again. Right?
I mean, interesting is some of the conversations that we could bracket off and then continue talking about what does it, once you're dead, once you have died, what is appropriate responses? And it becomes such a huge topic that I had to narrow some of that out. But, is it the medieval conversation or the scholastic conversation around what happens in the resurrection to a Christian who was dead, buried, decomposed, and then, because embalming is very new, modern, right? That is a modern technology, started during Abraham Lincoln so that he could be shown around the country after he was assassinated. And then it became kind of contemporary practice for all of us to be able to look presentable after death. Because as you will see, we don't look very presentable during death when we actively die. So technology has changed how we die, it changes where we die, both in terms of geography in a broad sense, but also location, either from the house to the hospital. Interesting, as I was preparing, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal about why doctors die differently. And the story is that the doctor was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Went to one of his doctor friends, and the doctor said, I have, it's not good, right? But I can triple your chances of survival by this new procedure that I do. It goes from 5 to 15%. He's 68, goes home, closes his practice as an orthopedic, and lives the rest of his life with no chemo treatment, no significant medical treatment other than some palliative care for pain, et cetera, et cetera. Quite a bit different than the majority of the rest of us, as it turns out. The rest of us tend to consume more resources at the end of our life fighting things like that, even with a 15% survival rate. In fact, doctors are 60% more likely, or 60% of doctors rather, it's not a predictive analytic, it's merely descriptive. So 60% of doctors compared to 20% of the general population in the US have advanced directives. Most of those advanced directives on the physician's part actually limit the, quote, heroic measures that would be taken to sustain their life. And it is sustained because they're not saving lives. Each will still die. Each of those doctors will still die. So the question that the article raises, well, why is there such a large discrepancy between these two things? And the article points to two things, and both both are interesting. One, the survival rates in CPR and TV. So they analyzed all of these CPR scenes in television shows and how often the patient survived, vis-a-vis the survival rates of actual patients who had CPR performed. So the team found that in 75% of cases in television, CPR was successful. So the person lived and went on to live a reasonably normal life. And 67% of those patients went home. So 75% successful, 67% of the successful patients went home. Everybody's good. Now, in reality, this 2010 study, more than 95,000 cases of CPR found that only 8% of patients survived more than 1 month. And of those, only 3% could lead a normal life. So one of the things that we know, especially in old age, bones are brittle and CPR breaks bones, period. That is a medical fact, well established in the literature. So doctors, knowing this, begin to make other choices. And the other part of that is increasingly doctors are giving opportunities to their patients to choose their own care. Right? It used to be that we went to the doctor as the expert. Now, I have friends who are doctors who would say that's a terrible idea in the first place also. but the idea that we dictate our own care based on our own whims without knowledge of medical science, with having an idea that CPR is successful 3/4 of the time, and almost fully 2/3, I'm going to return to whatever I was doing the day before I had the heart attack that put me in that place that necessitated the CPR in the first place. So technology has skewed what happens, and it's skewed what we do and how we respond. And so this is sort of and I think part of the reason we respond that we do is because there is a human, I think, a sort of universal human experience at play, and we see some of that in Scripture. And so we'll turn now to the second of the. So death, dead, or dying are mentioned nearly 800 times in Scripture, and that's just the actual words. That's not pericopes or stories where someone dies or experience the grief after someone dies. So not included in these counts are like the accounts of the disciples at the tomb, or the stoning of Stephen. So this is only the times that the actual word death or dying. And we'll zoom in, and there's just kind of a breakdown. And you can see it's actually a pretty interesting little breakdown of where those occurrences are found. Right? So you have a big number in the Torah, in the law. So the Genesis through Deuteronomy, and you'll notice a big cluster around Exodus and Leviticus. What's going on there? Right? The law.
Yeah.
And that is pretty much prescribed as punishment for every conceivable offense. In fact, in Genesis, death can actually be used. So this is Genesis 42:37. Then Reuben said to his father, "You may put my 2 sons to death if I do not bring him back to you," meaning the youngest son, who was to be held as collateral for safe passage through, because they thought that they were spies. So if I don't bring him back to you, you can kill my other 2 sons. Right? So you can kill my 2 sons if I don't fulfill my obligation, the promise I made to you. So death is a form of punishment. That is consistent. We see it in Exodus throughout. If you break the Sabbath, death. If you strike someone and kill them, death. If an ox has a history of goring and the owner doesn't make reasonable precautions, both the ox is stoned and the owner is put to death. So death figures pretty prominently as a punishment or as a consequence of choice, a consequence of behavior, of action. So you see that pretty clearly in the Torah. But we move to sort of other parts of the Hebrew Bible, and we end up in history. And these are really just kind of descriptive narratives. It's really just taken as a matter of fact. Many of the prophets date their conversation or when they're writing by the death of the king. So Isaiah, in the first year after the death of Uzziah, I am writing. So it's kind of a matter of fact, a way to mark time. With I think one of the interesting places is in the writings. So
Yeah.
the poetry, right? So, and this is where we get some of the existential angst, some of the fear. So we can see that in Scripture we have consequence or punishment. We have sort of this ambiguous relationship to it. It is both, as we will see. Out of Job, in the time of famine, the Lord will redeem you from death, and in the time of war, from the power of the sword. Here again in Job, sort of this ambiguity, so that I would prefer strangling and death more than life. So at some points, death looks like a more preferable option than does the ongoing struggle of life. Psalms. We see, my heart beats violently within me, the horrors of death overcome me. So sort of that existential angst. And then just a few lines later in the same psalm, this is Psalm 55, may death destroy them. I'm scared to death of it, but damn it, destroy them, destroy my enemy. So that doesn't get at the ambiguity of our experience around death. I'm not sure that we can. The Lord, Yahweh, is also seen as sovereign over death and life. We saw in Job, deliver me from the power of the sword, deliver me from famine. Psalm 56, deliver my life from death. Or Psalm 68:20, our God is a God who delivers. The sovereign Lord can rescue from death. And then Psalm 89 sort of solidifies what began the lecture this afternoon, that no person can live without experiencing death or deliver his or her life from the power of Sheol. Death is going to get each one of us. How we respond to death and how we die is both sometimes within our control and sometimes largely beyond it. The things that we can control is sort of where we're talking today. And it's not the case that we can control precisely when we die or our surroundings around death, but we can make choices about dying well in a context of living well. So again, in Psalm 116, we see, Lord, you saved me from death. The Lord severely punished me, but the Lord did not hand me over to death. So even being punished can be in a context of an ongoing relationship. Proverbs, sort of the collected wisdom of the Hebrew people. True righteousness leads to life, but the one who pursues evil pursues it to his own death. Proverbs 12, in the path of righteousness there is life, but another path leads to death. So again, we see this juxtaposition of life and death in the midst of ongoing living. And so death is also then this metaphor, or functions as a metaphor, for good conduct, living well, and being in a vital relationship with the covenant community and with the Lord. Seen again as punishment in Proverbs, the wicked will be thrown down in his or her trouble, but the righteous have refuge, even in the threat of death. Again, to underscore the sort of ongoing context of death and life as sort of metaphor, death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love its use will eat its fruit. So the tongue now has the ability to confer death and life. Not typically the muscle or human organ that we would associate with death and life, but this idea that how we are with people matters and can be described as life-giving or death-giving. Ecclesiastes is perhaps my my most favorite, and this weird juxtaposition that one can really not get one's head around, or at least this one can't. Ecclesiastes 7:1. A good reputation is better than precious perfume. Likewise, the day of one's death is better than the day of one's birth. The very next sentence, it is better to go to a funeral than to a feast. Okay. The next sentence, for death is the destiny of every person, and the living should take this to heart. Now, jumping down a little bit later in the passage, 7:26. I discovered this. More bitter than death. It goes on to compare it to a woman of ill repute. But the juxtaposition of death being better than one's birth and being bitter is an odd juxtaposition that sort of gets at the ambivalence and ambiguity that we experience. Song of Songs, there is a reference. And the references for love is as strong as death. So comparing love to death, and the claim that death has on each one of us, that's how strong love is. The prophets largely kind of pick up the theme of consequence, proclaiming that the people will or are being judged for what they have or have not done, to keep up the covenant, but also what they have done to perpetuate injustice, etc. And that is seen as God's judgment on the community. But even there, not every person in the community will die. In Jeremiah, this is particularly important because some are sent into exile into Babylon and then come back to Jerusalem. You can see the cluster now in the New Testament. We see some pretty heavy references in the, I think I can zoom in on that a little bit more. So there we are. So the numbers underneath are the number of times it occurs. So, and this is just the word death. So you can see what is interesting, right? Romans. What is Romans but a theological treatise of working out sort of atonement theory? What figures prominently in Corinthians? Conversation about the resurrection of the body. And so these two where it figures prominently, Hebrews also, sort of the epistle and the letter, working out in sort of a more Hebraic, in some sense, theology of death and theology of atonement. So it's not coincidental, I don't think, that theologians gravitate toward Romans in articulating some understanding of where death occurs. And it's in Romans where we get, for the wages of sin or death, for it comes through one man, Adam, and the second Adam, Christ, buys us redemption, gives us life. So it's in this context that we can summarize the Old Testament view and the New Testament view, or at least what I'm going to consider as Jesus, essentially a summary of Jesus' view, as near as we can sketch it. So the Old Testament view can be summarized as the power of Yahweh extends beyond the power of death. So, right, Yahweh can rescue. Death does not have its own power. Right? Yahweh is sovereign over it. If Yahweh can rescue us, then death is not sovereign. And it is not autonomous. It's not a force that can destroy the human person. Now concentrate on the human person as we sketch through the rest of this. The human person still is an individual before Yahweh, beyond death, and thus is still connected to the community of the living, though as a shadowy form of existence with no vital power. This is the concept of Sheol. It's not the fire and brimstone of hell that the evangelicals and Southern Baptists would have us. That's just not what the Jewish tradition maintained. So death is a threat to both the body and the soul. And while there is no clear teaching on the immortality of the person as a natural right, so contrast to Greek and Platonic thought, especially where the soul was immortal, and that the soul would the entire existence of the body trapped to the soul, and so this becomes very clear in the Docetic heresies of the soul needing to escape the body. So it is not a natural right. Immortality is not a natural right. And this idea will become important as we look at the theological tradition in just a second. So it is the promise and expectation of immortality through God's promise. The home of the dying is in Yahweh, who has power to keep life and keep the one who has died. The death therefore has its greatest threat in depriving the person of life, which is a vital relationship to Yahweh and the covenant community, in which both body and soul are an integrated unity. So evangelical New Testament scholar Leander Keck summarizes Jesus' teaching views on death as follows. First, Jesus accepted without criticism the contemporary rabbinic categories of death drawn from apocalyptic thought, such as judgment, resurrection, reward, and punishment. These are all things that we saw in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament. Secondly, Jesus shows little interest in disclosing the mysteries of death and what lies beyond. And I would add the caveat, if Jesus had such knowledge. And there's no clear statement that such knowledge was available and opted not to disclose it. Rather, we get parables about judgment that feature life and afterlife, thinking of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus in particular, where from those parables, systematicians, sometimes unhelpfully, then draw very significant statements about the afterlife, and I'm just not sure about a lot of that. I'm much more comfortable with the idea of material consequences of things that I can see and observe. If I have a bias, it's probably toward empirical data and empirical things. So without being a reductionist, those are sort of my concerns about making too much of stories and trying to then systematize a doctrine. Sort of that distinction between dogma and doctrine. Dogma, there is a resurrection of the body. Doctrine is specifically what that looks like, right? To kind of draw on the distinction that was made for us very helpfully, I think, by Dr. Ray last week. So there's little interest in disclosing the mysteries. We simply don't know. And as Dr. Waters mentioned, when Paul says we were raised with a spiritual body, you don't know either. Dr. Waters, not Paul. Paul may very well know, but I don't know. I don't know Paul. So, death was not the central problem to be resolved. I think that's a critical point. It was certainly not the thing that Jesus spent the time talking about. But rather it was one's openness to the kingdom of God, and that's where true blessing and the blessing of life. And so it was, again, this sort of vital connection to Yahweh and to the covenant community and how one responded to one's neighbors that really mattered in the life, death, and ultimately resurrection of Jesus. And so, right, we already sort of touched on the scripture, Romans and Corinthians figuring most prominently in Hebrews, and then Revelation, right, kind of the end, we're going to talk about death. So those are kind of the four books that really jump out within the canon of the New Testament as the place where death is talked about. And we're really kind of in those contexts working out sort of more of a systematic understanding, midrash, if you will, on the Hebrew traditions. And Paul is working with what is this Jesus got to do with that, and how do we make sense of Jesus' life, death, ministry, and resurrection that Paul's attesting to in light of the Hebrew tradition. So that brings us then to the theological tradition, right? And there are, sort of roughly two major traditions within the historical canon or the historical traditions up until modern. And the modern is really kind of a decisive moment because, as we will see, technology again raises some interesting questions. And so what do we see? So Augustine and Calvin sort of hold and Luther as well, being a good Augustinian monk after all, generally form a coherent tradition that regards death as a consequence of the fall. So in the garden, Adam and Eve were eating apple or apricot, as it probably was, eating fruit. I mean, apples don't grow in the Middle East. Like, that's just, right?
Or
Like,
dates,
right, dates,
Dates
apricots,
old.
really good, really good, but not apples.
sun dried.
Right, right. Aren't those, no, those aren't raisins.
Oh my.
So they're eating the fruit that they are not supposed to have eaten. And on this view, the fall introduces, or the sin that creates the fall, humanity was not subject to death prior to this disobedient act. So according to the Augustinian, Lutheran, Calvin Reformed tradition, death comes in as a consequence for disobedience, and prior to that, humanity would have gone on to live forever. Right? Really unproblematic, pretty straightforward reading of the text. Not only did it bring death in for humanity, but it also brought it into the entire created order. So animals, plants, potentially earth, sun, stars, decay and death were the wages of sin. So Irenaeus and later Schleiermacher, much later, would urge a view that's slightly different. From their perspective, and I think this is equally a plain reading of the text, the Genesis 1-2 account of the created order, that it differs from that strand of the tradition because Irenaeus articulated the view that Adam held a mortal but perfectible life. So, right, so in the narrative, we read that there was also a tree of life. And after they eat the fruit on the forbidden tree, knowledge of good and evil, they are prohibited from eating of the tree of life. So their argument follows quite forwardly that, well, if they had to be prevented from eating it, then they could have eaten it at any time because they were not prohibited from eating of that tree. So their argument is that it's a perfectible, so humanity could become mature and live forever. That is, if Adam hadn't sinned. So we have two views that can take a rather straightforward account of the biblical narrative and come to two different conclusions. Now, here's where the rub comes in for us moderns. Right? These theologians are thinking and writing about death prior to Darwin, prior to the origin of species, prior to exploration that finds fossils that are of pre-human or humanoids, prior to Neanderthal, prior to dinosaurs. There's a lot of stuff that's got to be worked out now. How does this sort of happen, right? So now we can have to wrestle with a view, at least a secular view now, that says, well, death is natural and a normal part of the human and created experience or evolving experience, right? So now modern theology, modern theologians have to cope with this empirical evidence that certainly throws a wrinkle in this idea that humanity either was perfect and that the created order was perfect, and that it was not going to die if this particular fruit hadn't been eaten, or that it even had the potential, right? Both of those views become problematic in light of empirical evidence in modern science. So Tillich well represents sort of this late, or this confrontation with modern science. And humanity is an evolved biological creature. The fall is not an event that changes human, animal, and plant biology, but as our cells and our structures and our basic DNA are not rendered differently as a result of the fall, but rather it's an existential event. Sin is not a historical event, but an existential one that centers upon our alienation from God and from other humans. And so we began to see here in modern time, modern theology, that we can differentiate between a separation of physical and spiritual. Now, whether that's helpful or not, I think that's an open question. But nevertheless, that is a consequence of confronting empirical science. We have to do something with this tradition, we have to do something with this story, and this is an alternative. We can go this route. There is a difference between physical and spiritual death. So, sort of the anti-Tillich, Karl Barth, too, held a view that's similar to Tillich's, but unlike Tillich, Barth took the Adam and Eve story to be historical. These were historical persons, these were historical creatures, but that God created them in a direct creation account. So they were, in fact, different from the animals. Tillich's view, we are an evolved animal. So Barth argued that dying was a natural part of our God-given but created nature. So human nature is subject to death. Now, this is where we're going to think back about the summary of a person, because dying, death, and decay, even from disease, could be present in a world prior to sin entering it. Indeed, the fossil record, the historical record, the geographical record, the scientific evidence suggests that indeed that's how the world works. And so it was, I think, in my view, unarguably present before the fall. Whatever, either as a historical event or as a metaphor. But here's the dialectic in Barth's theology, that human nature is not the same as human personhood, right? So we have a human nature that is part of what constitutes human personhood, right? You can't be a human person without a human nature, but human personhood is not reducible to human nature, and human nature is not conflated to human personhood. So you can't have one without the other, but they are not the same. And so human nature can be subject to death, but it's God who holds the human personhood in constant unity with divinity. And so it's this trajectory that in death, God is still capable of holding on to the human person, our individual identities, and it's this that will be raised body and soul or in the resurrection of body and soul. So we have sort of 3 or 4 options, kind of broadly speaking. There are some nuanced views within this, but these are sort of the major ways to kind of figure out what to do with death. Right? Process theology obviously sees it as incredibly natural. Some of the current eco-feminists and eco-feminist theologians argue that it's entirely natural, and there's one whose name escapes me at present, but her argument is that it's obviously then the fall is a metaphor, and not eating the tree is not destroying the rainforest. And so we get this very sort of contextual understanding once you lose it from a historical perspective or believing that it's an historical account, and losing it in this existential angst. And we've seen that there is a good reason for a lot of existential angst. And so far from answering questions about the theology, simply raising the questions and raising the theological traditions that bear upon what does it mean to die to death, and what is death after all. Because in some sense we have to answer the question, what is death and why do we die, in order to begin to contemplate what it is to die well, or to die a good death. But so if part of it is a biological fact that we are all going to die, and that at least our human nature is going to die, and our human personhood dies with our human nature. It's not the case that the human personhood exists without the human nature. Those two things are put to death simultaneously, but the human personhood can be reconstituted by God along with some other resurrected body. Whatever that looks like, again, I don't know. So it's a process. We talk about death as a process of physical and emotional, and this is a little bit graphic, but important. So the process of dying, a couple of stories before we look at both of these. The difference between dying in a hospital and dying at home with hospice care, I would submit, is the difference between, or a qualitative part of dying well, of a good death. The dilemma I want to sort of set with you in terms of the process, and as we look at some of what physically happens as a person dies, hopefully within the next sort of 10 minutes, so we can have some time for discussion after. What happens is a biological shutting down of the organs, etc. And this takes place over weeks, days, and you kind of break the dying process down into approaching death and then the phase of actively dying. Well, what happens when technology interferes with that? What happens is you end up with a patient and an ethics consult that I was in as a chaplain at a local hospital in Southern California, where mom was in her 90s. I don't remember her exact age. She was in her 90s. She had 4th stage bed sores. For those of you that are unfamiliar with a bed sore, it's like a cut or a burn in a sense. They can stage them. And 4th stage bed sores have begun the tunneling process and are no longer just a surface wound, but require being packed with tissue and gauze, and it's basically an eating of the flesh from the outside in. And it's caused from pressure. I mean, it's essentially a pressure sore. And so if you have pressure too long on the same parts of your body, and as you get older, your skin does not regenerate as fast, and you're not moving, you're less mobile, and so bed sores are a pernicious problem and rather unpleasant. Well, so she had 4th stage bed sores over most of her back and legs, the parts of contact that are consistently under pressure when you're laying in a bed. Now that's unfortunately a significant part often of dying process. It's not entirely avoidable, though precautions can be taken to mitigate against it. That said, mom was on a feeding tube and had been on a feeding tube for 8 years. Yeah. So the feeding tube is what's keeping mom alive. Right? She's breathing on her own, she has brain activity, at least enough to keep her basic systems going. So her breathing, her bowel movements, the sort of base level of function. And contracted into the fetal position and had been that way for several years. So,
Yeah, did you say years?
yeah. Yeah, she had been on a feeding tube for 8 years, and she had been,
How many years?
8.
Wow.
So she's now in an acute care hospital setting. And the doctor absolves any sort of responsibility for describing what will happen or what ought to happen, giving no direction to the family of what ought to happen. So in comes me. And the breakdown of the family conversation is essentially this. One son says, if we keep her alive, but if we keep the feeding tube in, we're torturing her. On the other side of the table sits the sister, who says, if we take the feeding tube out, we're killing her. Both of these people have to live with whatever decision they make as regards mom's care. Partially because there's no advance directive, partially because technology has intruded into the process, right? Historically in this country, when you stopped eating, you died. People didn't feed you. When you could no longer carry the spoon to your mouth, that was when you began the dying process. Other cultures, the Eskimo, for example, will push people out onto an iceberg and let them die away from the community when they are no longer productive. I had a hospice patient ask me to do that. And I said, I don't have any icebergs, man. But we did have to talk through euthanasia, because on his view, he was no longer productive. Even though even on hospice, he was a friend of Bill W. and had folks in his house who were in recovery or who were trying to become sober, and his place was a safe place that they could come stay. So even as he was dying on hospice, he was profoundly impacting certain communities, and yet his experience of death and angst couldn't clearly see that. So again, death is ambiguous for us. So as we approach death, the body starts to shut down. You may notice older people in general have colder hands, constantly cold, your skin's cold. It starts to mottle, just the plasticity goes out of your skin, your blood pressure lowers, all of these things, much more lethargy, all weakness, kind of a general malaise. The body becomes less adept at clearing sort of normal bodily fluids, so secretions can build up, etc. And this can take, a week, 2 weeks. Modeling, real death modeling doesn't happen until very close, until the actively dying. But the discoloration and the skin losing plasticity can happen. I mean, it happens relatively often, but to varying degrees. The very sort of approaching death, and it's a very noticeable loss of plasticity where the skin actually won't sort of go back to shape. So during active, so in terms of the process of dying, I'm going to play the first clip now. This is a video.
What do you mean?
Where do I go?
Where do you go?
The little town on the bridge.
The bridge to where?
At the other end.
Tell me, you mean heaven?
Who's coming? Somebody's coming?
No, nobody's coming, Papa.
I don't know. I'm all gone.
What do you mean?
What?
You're all done? No, you're not.
I'm all done. I'm all done. There's no more roads.
No more roses?
No more road.
No more road?
I'm on the last one.
Wow.
I'm on the last road. There's no more.
Why?
There's nowhere to build them.
Wow.
But
So,
you gotta take what's left.
so what are you gonna do?
We're not gonna fly through the air.
Okay? Tell me more.
Fly through the air.
Mm-hmm.
What are you doing?
Mm-hmm.
What is doing?
Love you, Papa.
I love you too, Joey.
Good luck, Papa.
Good luck, Joey.
Be strong. You're a strong man, right?
Yeah.
Be strong.
The days are gone forever. They're gone forever.
So that first video is very much the natural process of dying. So you see someone who is just sort of reminiscing and thinking, but not in any sort of coherent fashion. Really kind of, in the first encounter, eerie, sort of unexplainable. But that is a natural thing. That conversation is quite remarkable from a because most of us don't have those kinds of conversations. Most of us try to push it off and push it away and sanitize it, but that's what a hospice death can look like. That is what a death that sort of disavows heroic technology. We saw he had oxygen in. So availing himself of some technology, but not willing or not embracing I need to live at all costs. The dying often know when they're close. I don't know why. But that seems to be a consistent thing that happens. So then after this sort of phase where he's more or less coherent, and that honestly I've seen happen at points where it is minutes before someone dies. I've seen it where that's been 3 days before they died. In the context of my mom's death, she was comatose or in an altered state of consciousness because of liver toxins, and so there was not. We had a week or so where she had come from the home from the hospital and had been able to talk and interact, but the time, because of the particular disease process that she had, really shut down the brain before anything else. And so she had been, there was no sort of kind of processing like this for her. So then the question becomes, well, what happens when we actively die? So what is the process that happens when the person begins to actively die? And there's often a moaning that's associated with breathing. That's the secretions that can often build up, and they are loud, often able to be heard from outside of the room in the hallway. There can be pain with or without movement, which is often why you're receiving morphine doses. And I think Dr. Waters talked about the principle of double effect, where you're administering the morphine dose to alleviate either knowing or unknowing pain. The assumption is the person is in some physical distress, but they can no longer obviously ask for pain medicine. And so you're administering morphine doses to alleviate the pain in a palliative way, but the double effect of morphine is that it suppresses breath. It suppresses the response system that's responsible for the respiratory system. And so the principle of double effect is that it does, in fact, hasten or speed up the process of dying because the breath is being suppressed at the same time that pain is being alleviated. So that's the principle of double effect. That is not the same thing as physician-assisted suicide, or the way in a U.S. context and probably Western developed world context uses euthanasia. So we tend to think of it as easy dying, and somehow easy dying means taking a pill and choosing to die, rather than this natural process that the body is designed for. And so there's a lot of loss of color. Again, this is where modeling really happens. Blood will begin to cool because the circulation system is shut down. In some cases, control of bodily fluids is lost. Breathing becomes significantly labored. You go very the last two breaths that my mom took were minutes apart. They seem like each breath is the last breath, and you don't know which breath is actually the last breath. There's clearly, in her case, and in most cases, as you see in this clip, a very clear lack of presence, for lack of a better word. There's a vacant stare if your eyes are open, as often tends to be the case. The mouth is typically open. It is both not pretty and natural. And I think that's where Christian moral theology has to wrestle in contemporary society, is both the natural and the profound unnatural aspect of death. It seems to me that death cannot be good when grieving causes so much pain. And so how is it that death can both be natural and cause so much pain, and be natural and necessary for a good created order, it seems, and yet cause so much pain? And that's, I think, the question that we enter as Christian moral theologians, as pastors, when we think about our responses to individual cases within our congregation and within healthcare policy. Right, so this is a little disturbing. This is someone who is actually dying, and that is the death rattle. Yeah.
I was just curious, in looking for those YouTube videos, are you finding a lot of people recording people's deaths? Because that, to me, that's another question to be considered.
Right,
Interesting.
so this was part of a larger clip of an education
Okay.
series. This
Okay.
particular clip. The other clip was a family posting.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me.
I mean, right, like, on the one hand, it's weird, and some of the responses on the second clip, the responses were turned off by the poster.
Right.
In the second one, or in the first one, they were not, and the responses ranged from, like, what is wrong with you, to, like, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And really everything in between. But, I mean, it is an interesting, right? So with my own family story, I didn't really have any interest in filming the death.
Right.
But my grandparents were around, my mom's sister was there, a couple of her best friends were there at the time of death. I was there, my brother was there, my dad was there, and as we sat around or as most of us sat around in the living room, and being both son and professional chaplain, sort of trying to navigate that experience, with my family, and personally, wanting to record the stories, because I know my family's not going to keep talking about this and not going to keep talking about her. And my kids, at that point, I figured I was going to have kids. Now it's more of an open question. Now, was I called to have kids? I don't know. But my life trajectory, as I imagined it, was going to have kids. But my dad's response was like, why the hell would you want to do that? That's terrible. And to me, this is an opportunity to capture stories that are never going to be told again, and to be able to share with potential grandkids who their grandmother was, in ways that I could never tell, because some of those stories I don't know, right? They were stories of her childhood and so it is this sort of weird, right? But that was going to be for personal, family, not for public consumption, not on YouTube or Facebook or whatever the newest thing is that I probably don't know about. We have about 10 minutes until class is over. What are some of the questions or thoughts?
I just want to thank you for sharing. I mean, I appreciate your honesty about your own experience. I think that's always helpful. And so thank you for just sharing your own story. This was really interesting. My father just passed in January, and so it was just, I was a little concerned about the clips, but it wasn't as bad.
No, I'm trying to be discriminating.
I understand, but I mean, just from a personal
No,
perspective,
for sure,
you know, a person
for sure.
where you're gonna go, so. But I appreciate the way you kind of broke this down.
Other questions or thoughts about what it would mean then to construct a theology of death, or thinking about one's own death?
As you had me walk through the death of my mother this year, I was not there for her very last breath, but to watch her struggle in those moments were very hard. And then as well, lost a very dear friend a couple of weeks ago. And to me, it kind of, in both situations where I think the theology behind it is really helping the family to grapple with what is God here. Particularly in my context where we pray and believe God is here. And so that healing doesn't come from the day that we think it should. And people are able to do it really well. And having to help people come to grips with that, I think is very important. And just understanding that what healing looks like may not be fully restored to this side, but full restoration as we go into our glorified state.
Actually, within the tradition, a piece that I neglected to mention is that death sometimes is seen as merciful, right? Because if you are constantly in a state of sin, and you are in a situation where you are constantly harming self and others as a result of the fall, be it existential or historical, you are never going, should you live forever, you are never going to not be in a state where you are harmful to others and yourself. And so there is a strand that sees death as actually a merciful gift of God in order to bring about completion in the resurrection and an end to the natural evil or moral evil.
So like when Paul says, to live is Christ and to die is gain, he said in his mind, because he had seen the future glory, he said, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. That's how we, in my context, minister to people and dealing with that separation from, the body to the spirit.
Right. I mean, again, I would put that in the category for myself, and when I was working as a hospice chaplain, I put that in the category of I don't know. And particularly in a chaplain's perspective, I don't have a common theological language with the people who were on service with us. Right? I had, in Southern California, I had Buddhists, I had devout Catholics who had influence from indigenous religious cultures in Mexico. I had patients that were Christian Science. And so running the gamut, and so one can't assume, particularly in that context, what the other person believes. A number of times nurses called me and said, what did I say that upset this family so much? Was largely because they asserted their own theological belief in ways that were significantly different than the family or the surviving person. In one case, I don't remember precisely which tradition it was, but it was a tradition that did not hold to a view of soul sleep. Or rather, it was a tradition that held to the view of soul sleep. And her own theological tradition and belief was that absent from the body meant present with God. And so she said, you know, the patient is with God, and actually pissed the woman, the surviving spouse off, to be blunt. And she was called me hysterical. Like, what did I say? And I was like, well, this is why. And so it's really helpful if you're in a tradition and everyone shares a common theological understanding, or at least a common language. But I think the case can't be made from Scripture that we have a clear understanding of what happens when we die. And so I'm more interested in the material consequences of the person who's surviving. And I'm rather agnostic, or a lack of profundity, I don't know, on the other questions. Any other questions? All right, we will see you next week.